When I first moved into the neighborhood, I thought I had found the perfect place to build a quiet, happy life. The streets were clean, the lawns manicured, and most of the houses looked nearly identical, all approved by the HOA for their uniformity and community pride. But beneath that polished surface was a brewing tension. I never expected one that would start. Of all things, with my dog. Max was not just a dog, he was family. A large, mixed-breed rescue with the kind of warm eyes that melted away the stress of the day. He wasn't aggressive, he wasn't dangerous, and he wasn't destructive. At worst, Max barked occasionally when the mail carrier arrived, or when a squirrel darted across the yard. For me, that was just normal dog behavior. But for the HOA, it became the perfect excuse to target me. The first notice arrived just 2 weeks after I moved in. A letter slipped into my mailbox, printed with the HOA's letterhead, carrying that unnerving tone of official authority. It said that multiple neighbors had expressed concerns about excessive barking and that my dog might be in violation of the neighborhood's quiet hours. The letter didn't specify times or recordings, only vague complaints. At first, I laughed it off. Who complains about a dog barking a couple of times a day? Still, I took it seriously enough to keep Max indoors longer, shorten his outside time, and even invest in extra toys to keep him distracted. For a while, I thought that would be enough. But the letters kept coming. Each one was more aggressive than the last, filled with threats of fines and legal action if the so-called nuisance wasn't dealt with. The second letter claimed that Max's breed might not even be on the HOA's approved list of pets. That line made my blood boil. Max wasn't a wolf, he wasn't a pit bull, and even if he had been, the HOA had never once provided me with any documentation about a so-called breed restriction list before I moved in. The truth began to reveal itself when I started talking with neighbors. A handful of them shrugged, saying they'd never heard Max bark at all. Others whispered about one particular woman on the HOA board, who had a reputation for targeting anyone new, anyone different, anyone who didn't fit her picture of the perfect neighborhood. She was the type of person who measured grass with a ruler and left. Anonymous notes about trash cans being placed out too early, and now she had set her sights on me. Within a month, the situation escalated further. I came home to find a bright orange notice taped to my front door. This wasn't a simple warning, it was a violation notice, complete with a deadline to remove the dog from the property or face escalating fines, potential liens, and even legal action. The HOA claimed Max was a danger to the community, an unapproved breed that posed a threat to safety and quality of life. Reading that notice, my stomach dropped. Remove my dog? They were treating Max like he was contraband, like I was harboring some kind of weapon instead of a loyal companion. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about a barking complaint. This was war. I spent that night pacing the living room, Max sleeping soundly on the rug as though unaware his very home was at stake. Every time I looked at him, the knot in my chest tightened. Giving him up was not an option. Paying endless fines wasn't an option either. The HOA had overstepped, and I needed to find a way to fight back. The next day, I began gathering every piece of paper I could. The HOA's bylaws, my purchase agreement, community rules, all of it. I combed through the fine print until my eyes burned. That's when I noticed something strange. The so-called approved pet list was vague, referencing only standard household pets with no details on breed. The bylaws also stated that animals could not create continuous disturbances, but nothing defined what that meant, nor did it explain how complaints were verified. Everything was worded loosely, almost intentionally, to give the board as much power as possible while leaving homeowners vulnerable. But their sloppy wording was also their weakness. As I sat at my kitchen table with stacks of documents, I felt the shift inside me. The HOA had made this personal. They underestimated me, assuming I would cave to their pressure like so many before me. They didn't expect me to dig into the laws beyond their bylaws. They didn't expect me to learn that in my state, breed-specific bans were not only unenforceable but outright illegal. And they definitely didn't expect me to consider the one thing most homeowners fear when dealing with an HOA: legal action. Max stretched lazily at my feet as though sensing the storm brewing. His quiet trust fueled my determination. I wasn't going to let the HOA bully me into submission. They thought they could write a letter and scare me into compliance. Instead, they had lit a fire. By the end of that week, I had a plan forming. I wasn't going to respond with anger. I wasn't going to argue with them on their terms. I was going to beat them at their own game by using the law they thought they understood but clearly didn't. This battle was no longer about one dog barking. It was about principle. It was about standing up against abuse of power. And as I filed away the violation notice, I knew one thing for certain. The HOA had picked the wrong homeowner to mess with. And soon they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The week after receiving the violation notice was strangely quiet. For a brief moment, I wondered if the HOA had moved on. If perhaps they had turned their attention to someone else's lawn, mailbox, or shutters. But that illusion shattered when I checked my mailbox one morning and found a thick envelope waiting for me. Inside was not just another warning. It was a full-blown packet of violations, citations, and threats. The packet outlined everything the HOA claimed I had done wrong. At the top of the list, of course, was Max. They described him as a continuous disturbance, claiming he barked at all hours of the day and night. They even accused him of being visibly intimidating to neighbors. The absurdity of the wording made my blood boil. Max wasn't a guard dog pacing the fence line, snarling at children. He was a goofy, tail-wagging rescue who liked belly rubs and naps in the sun. But the HOA had twisted his very existence into a threat. The second section of the packet was worse. They included supposed fines totaling hundreds of dollars, demanding immediate payment. Each violation carried its own penalty, and they threatened to escalate further if I didn't comply. At the very bottom was the ultimate threat. Failure to resolve the issue could result in legal liens on my property. The arrogance was staggering. Here was a group of volunteers, a neighborhood board that thought itself above the law, wielding power like it was a weapon. They assumed fear would make me fold, and for many homeowners it probably did. That's how they maintained control, through intimidation. Half-truths and vague rules no one dared to question. But unlike those before me, I wasn't afraid. I began documenting everything. Every letter, every fine, every scrap of paper they slid into my mailbox went into a growing binder. I set up a camera in my backyard to capture Max's behavior, recording long stretches of footage to prove he wasn't barking endlessly as they claimed. Each piece of evidence was like ammunition, and I was preparing for a war I never asked for but now refused to back down from. Still, the pressure grew. Neighbors began to whisper. Some asked if I had really received so many complaints. Others avoided me entirely, no doubt swayed by the HOA's smear campaign. It became clear that the board wasn't just targeting me privately. They were painting me as the problem homeowner, the one disrupting the neighborhood's peace. It was an insidious tactic, isolating me from allies, making me feel like I was standing alone against an entire community. But beneath that hostility, there were cracks. A few neighbors confided quietly that they didn't believe the HOA's claims. One mentioned that they had a dog themselves, and yet had never once been scrutinized. Another admitted that the board president, the same woman who had a reputation for bullying newcomers, had personally complained about Max more than anyone else. The pieces began to fit together. This wasn't about barking. This wasn't about rules. This was about control, and it was personal. With each passing day, the HOA's tactics became more desperate. I came home one afternoon to find another notice taped to my door, this time citing me for failure to maintain community standards. The supposed violation? A small dog toy left in the yard. Another time, they cited me for unsightly conditions because of a patch of grass that had grown slightly taller after a week of rain. These were not real violations. They were harassment disguised as policy. Every notice fueled my resolve. Instead of reacting with anger, I calmly filed them away, adding them to my growing mountain of evidence. Because I knew something the HOA didn't. I had spent hours researching state laws, digging into legal precedents, and even reaching out quietly to a local attorney. What I discovered was a goldmine. In my state, breed-specific restrictions were unenforceable. The HOA's claim that Max was an unapproved breed was baseless. On top of that, harassment through excessive, arbitrary fines could be considered abuse of power. And most importantly, the law required HOAs to follow a strict due process for any enforcement action, something they had clearly failed to do. They thought they were the law, but the real law was on my side. As I pieced together my plan, I felt a shift in my mindset. I wasn't just defending Max anymore. I was defending myself, my home, and my right to live without being bullied by a group of overzealous neighbors. With too much time on their hands, the more I prepared, the more confident I became. But the HOA wasn't slowing down. Just when I thought they had run out of tactics, they escalated again. This time, they announced a special meeting to address ongoing disturbances in the neighborhood. Disturbances that were, of course, directed at me and Max. It was clear they were trying to rally the community against me, to humiliate me in front of my neighbors, to force me into submission. The notice for the meeting was the final straw. I realized they wouldn't stop until I was broken, until Max was gone, or until I proved to them that I wasn't someone they could push around. And proving it meant more than ignoring their fines. It meant striking back in a way they couldn't ignore. I wasn't just going to defend Max. I was going to turn their own system against them. I was going to use the law they claimed to uphold and expose the hypocrisy at the very core of their authority. As I closed the binder filled with evidence and stared at the violation, notice taped to my door, I made a silent promise. The HOA thought they held all the power, but they were about to discover just how powerless they truly were when confronted with someone who refused to play by their rigged rules. The upcoming meeting wouldn't just be another attack on me. It would be the stage for their downfall. The day of the meeting arrived with the kind of tension that hung in the air like a storm ready to break. For days, I had seen the notices plastered around the neighborhood, inviting homeowners to attend a special session regarding disturbances that were negatively impacting community standards. Everyone knew what the notice really meant. It wasn't subtle. I was the target and Max was the excuse. That evening, I walked into the small community clubhouse where the meeting was being held. The room was already buzzing with voices. Neighbors clustered in groups, whispering, glancing toward me as I entered. Some faces were sympathetic, others judgmental, but most simply curious. After all, drama was rare in this quiet, manicured neighborhood, and the HOA had provided them with a spectacle. At the front of the room sat the board members behind a long folding table. Their expressions were stiff, controlled, but I could see the flickers of smug satisfaction in their eyes. This was their arena, their carefully staged moment to put me in my place. The president, the woman who had driven this campaign against me from the start, sat in the center, her posture radiating authority. The meeting began predictably. They launched into a presentation of so-called evidence against me and Max. Charts, printed complaints, and dramatic wording designed to paint a picture of chaos. According to them, Max was a constant disturbance, his barking disrupting sleep, frightening children, and damaging the peaceful enjoyment of the neighborhood. The more they talked, the more exaggerated their claims became. I sat silently, binder in hand, letting them build their case. I could feel the eyes of the room on me, some filled with suspicion, others with doubt. They expected me to sit there in shame, to crumble under the weight of their accusations. That was how this usually went. Most homeowners had no defense, no preparation, and no energy to fight back. But I wasn't most homeowners. When the board finished their performance, they opened the floor for discussion. Neighbors raised concerns, some parroting the HOA's claims, others hesitant, but still influenced by the authority of the board. The atmosphere was heavy, leaning toward condemnation, the tide slowly pushing against me. And then it was my turn. I stood, binder in hand, and calmly began presenting my evidence. I explained that Max's barking was occasional, no different from any other dog in the neighborhood. I showed video footage proving long stretches of silence, undermining the claim of constant barking. I flipped through the HOA bylaws, pointing out the vague language that never once defined excessive noise or provided a method of verification. Then I delivered the blow they weren't expecting. I cited state law, clearly stating that breed-specific restrictions were not enforceable, rendering their claim about Max being an unapproved breed completely invalid. The room shifted as murmurs spread among the neighbors. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. For the first time, cracks began to show in their polished facade. But I wasn't finished. I laid out the excessive fines they had attempted to levy against me, noting how each was arbitrary and unrelated to actual violations. I highlighted the harassment, the notices for dog toys in the yard, The claims about unsightly conditions after rain. I explained how their actions were not only baseless, but potentially illegal under state homeowner protection laws. The atmosphere in the room changed. Some neighbors looked uncomfortable, realizing they had been misled. Others nodded quietly, their skepticism of the HOA finally finding validation. The board, however, was furious. The president's face hardened, her control slipping as she realized the narrative was no longer theirs to command. The meeting devolved quickly after that. The board tried to regain authority, insisting that their rules were final, that their authority could not be challenged. But the damage was done. I had exposed their overreach, their harassment, and their disregard for the law. And I hadn't shouted, I hadn't raged, I had calmly, methodically dismantled their case with facts and evidence. By the time the meeting ended, the board was visibly shaken. They had wanted to humiliate me, to break me in front of my neighbors. Instead, they had been publicly challenged. Their authority weakened, their credibility questioned. But I knew better than to celebrate too soon. The HOA wasn't going to back down after one meeting. People like that didn't surrender easily. They thrived on control, and losing it was something they would fight against with every tool they had. Sure enough, the very next day, another letter appeared in my mailbox. This one was colder, more threatening than the others. The board accused me of disruptive behavior at the meeting and warned of further consequences if I continued to challenge their authority. It was clear they weren't retreating. They were doubling down again. And that was when I made my decision. The meeting had shown me that the board could be embarrassed. But embarrassment alone wouldn't stop them. They needed to be forced into compliance. They needed to learn, once and for all, that their self-proclaimed power had limits. I wasn't going to play defense anymore. I was going to take the fight to them. I reached out formally to the attorney I had spoken to earlier, this time providing the full binder of evidence. Every violation notice, every letter, every absurd claim was laid out in order. The attorney listened carefully, then confirmed what I already suspected. The HOA was in clear. Violation of state law, and their actions bordered on harassment. Filing a lawsuit against the HOA wasn't a step I took lightly. It meant escalating the conflict, drawing an even brighter spotlight on myself. But it also meant protection. It meant no more flimsy notices taped to my door. No more endless fines piling up. No more threats to take Max away. As I signed the first round of paperwork, a strange sense of calm washed over me. For weeks, I had been reacting to the HOA, waiting for their next move, feeling like I was on the defensive, but now, for the first time, the power shifted. The HOA thought they could bully me into submission. Instead, they had pushed me to the point where I was ready to fight them with the very laws they thought they controlled. Max lay beside me that night, his breathing steady, his presence grounding me in the chaos. He had no idea the storm that swirled around him, no idea that his existence had triggered this battle. But as I looked at him, I felt a renewed determination. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every homeowner who had ever been silenced, bullied, or intimidated by an HOA that believed itself untouchable. And soon, the board would learn just how touchable they really were. Filing the lawsuit marked the turning point. Up until that moment, the HOA had been the aggressor, throwing letters, fines, and intimidation tactics at me like stones. But the moment the paperwork went through, the dynamic shifted. They were no longer just issuing threats. They were being forced to defend themselves under the law they had twisted for so long. The attorney moved quickly. He compiled every piece of evidence I had collected, framing it not as a pile of annoyances, but as a clear pattern of harassment. The excessive fines, the baseless violations, the fabricated complaints, all of it told the story of an HOA abusing its power against a single homeowner. More importantly, the lawsuit highlighted the HOA's attempt to enforce an illegal breed restriction, a move that state law explicitly forbade. That detail alone was enough to put the board in serious jeopardy. The papers were served within a week. Word spread through the neighborhood faster than wildfire. For years, the HOA had loomed as an untouchable authority, the final word on every fence height, paint color, and mailbox placement. But now, one of their own homeowners had dragged them into court. To many, it was unthinkable. To others, it was inspiring. I began noticing a shift in how neighbors treated me. The suspicious glances were replaced by nods of quiet respect. A few even stopped by to offer words of support, though they spoke in hushed tones, as if afraid the board might overhear. Some confessed that they, too, had been unfairly fined or harassed, but had never dared to fight back. I had become, unintentionally, the one standing up for all of them. The board, however, was not humbled. They reacted with fury. Within days, another letter arrived in my mailbox, this one declaring that my actions were detrimental to community harmony and that I was abusing the legal system. They doubled down on their threats, warning that my lawsuit would only result in greater fines, more violations, and ultimately, financial ruin. It was a desperate attempt to intimidate me into backing down, but instead of feeling fear, I felt vindication. Their letter was evidence. Every threat they made only strengthened my case. Every fine they attempted to levy became another example of harassment. They couldn't see it, but they were digging their own grave, one notice at a time. Behind the scenes, the attorney kept me updated. The HOA had been caught off guard. They weren't used to homeowners challenging them, let alone in a court of law. They scrambled to find legal representation of their own. But their defense was weak. Their bylaws were vague, their enforcement inconsistent, and their records sloppy. What they had once used to instill fear now became their greatest liability. As the legal process moved forward, the tension in the neighborhood grew unbearable. The board continued to posture, but cracks began to show. Rumors circulated that some board members were privately questioning the president's obsession with my case. Others worried about the financial strain of a lawsuit. After all, defending themselves meant using community funds, money that came directly from the pockets of every homeowner. And as more residents learned their dues were being spent on a petty vendetta against my dog, support for the board began to erode. The president, however, refused to relent. She called emergency meetings, rallied her allies, and tried to spin the narrative that I was the one threatening the community. But the louder she shouted, the more desperate she appeared. And the more desperate she appeared, the more people began to see through her. Meanwhile, I focused on building my case. Every new violation notice went straight into the binder. Every baseless threat was logged. I even obtained a letter from a local veterinarian, verifying that Max was healthy, non-aggressive, and of mixed breed. Further, proof that the HOA's unapproved breed claim was nonsense. Piece by piece, I was dismantling their authority. But the lawsuit wasn't just about proving them wrong. It was about accountability. For too long, they had operated unchecked, believing their rules carried more weight than the actual law. My goal wasn't just to win for myself, it was to set a precedent that would protect every homeowner who came after me. As the court date approached, the HOA's behavior became increasingly erratic. They attempted to fine me for leaving my trash can out too long, even though I had photographic proof of it being placed within the allowed hours. They cited me for improper landscaping after a heavy storm knocked branches into my yard. Each attempt was more ridiculous than the last, and each one went straight into the growing pile of evidence against them. Through it all, Max remained blissfully unaware. He lounged in the sun, chased squirrels, and barked happily when I came home from work. He didn't know he was the center of a battle that had consumed the neighborhood. To him, life was simple: food, walks, and companionship. And in a way, that simplicity grounded me. Whenever the stress threatened to overwhelm me, I looked at Max and remembered why I was fighting in the first place. The night before the court hearing, I sat at my kitchen table with the binder open in front of me. Every page told a story, not just of harassment, but of resilience. I had started this journey feeling isolated, targeted, and powerless. Now I felt prepared, strong, and ready to stand my ground. The HOA thought they could bully me into giving up my dog. Instead, they had created a homeowner determined to expose them. Tomorrow, we would stand before a judge, and for the first time, their authority would be questioned not by whispers or complaints, but by the law itself. As I closed the binder and turned off the light, I felt a calm determination settle over me. Whatever happened in that courtroom, I knew one thing for certain: the HOA would never look at me or any homeowner the same way again. The courthouse had an air of quiet finality, the kind of place where arrogance and bluster crumbled under the weight of truth. As I walked through the tall glass doors that morning, binder tucked under my arm, I felt the culmination of weeks of stress, anger, and preparation pressing down on me. This was it, the moment the HOA could no longer hide behind notices and intimidation. Today, their actions would be judged. The board arrived together, huddled like a pack circling their leader. At the front was the president, her expression sharp and unyielding, though I caught flickers of unease beneath her composure. They carried folders of paperwork, thick but unorganized, clearly hoping the sheer volume would make up for the lack of substance. It was the same tactic they had used on homeowners for years: overwhelm, intimidate, and pressure into submission. But here, in this courtroom, those tactics would falter. When the session began, the judge called both sides forward. The HOA's attorney started with confidence, presenting the board as protectors of the neighborhood, guardians of peace and order. He described Max as a serious nuisance, claiming the barking was disruptive and dangerous. He even suggested that my dog posed a potential safety risk. It was a performance more than an argument, each word carefully chosen to paint me as reckless and irresponsible, but performances crumble under evidence. When my attorney stood to respond, the tone shifted. He began methodically dismantling the HOA's claims piece by piece. He pointed out the vague language in the bylaws, highlighting how no specific definition of excessive noise or approved breeds existed. He presented state law, crystal clear in its prohibition of breed-specific enforcement, making the HOA's central argument not just weak, but illegal. Then came the binder. Page by page, violation by violation, the story unfolded, not of a dog disturbing the peace, but of a board obsessed with control. The judge flipped through photos of my yard, watched video clips of Max lounging silently in the sun, and read letter after letter of increasingly hostile threats. What had once felt like endless harassment now stood as undeniable proof of abuse. Neighbors had also submitted statements. Some described the board's pattern of intimidation. Others vouched for Max's gentle nature. One even admitted they had never heard him bark at all. Their words carried weight, shifting the narrative from a personal dispute to a broader issue of HOA misconduct. The president grew visibly restless as the evidence piled higher. She whispered furiously to the HOA's attorney, her confidence unraveling with each passing minute. What had begun as an opportunity to cement her authority had turned into a public unraveling of her power. The judge listened quietly, rarely interrupting, but I could see the impression forming. This wasn't a case of a disruptive homeowner. This was a case of an overreaching HOA, one that had forgotten its role was to serve the community, not dominate it. By midday, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted completely. The HOA was no longer on offense. They were scrambling to justify their actions, their attorney resorting to broad generalizations and exaggerated claims. My side, however, had facts, law, and evidence. And facts, law, and evidence always carried more weight than empty authority. When the hearing finally concluded, the judge announced that a decision would be rendered in the coming weeks. No immediate resolution, no dramatic final gavel strike, just the quiet reality of waiting. But even without a verdict, I walked out of the courthouse with a sense of victory. The board had been exposed, their bluster pierced, their authority questioned in a place where intimidation held no sway. Outside, a small group of neighbors had gathered, curious about the outcome. Some nodded approvingly as I left. No words exchanged, just silent acknowledgement. It was clear that the case had already begun reshaping the community. The once invincible board was vulnerable. Their actions scrutinized not just by me, but by everyone who paid dues into their system. The days that followed were tense. The board retreated into silence, their once steady stream of violation notices abruptly stopping. Meetings were held behind closed doors, whispers of division spreading among members. Some questioned whether continuing the fight was worth draining community funds. Others clung stubbornly to the belief that they could still win, still crush me under the weight of their authority. Meanwhile, I felt lighter than I had in months. The harassment had paused. Max was safe, and for the first time, I wasn't reacting to the HOA, I was simply waiting. Waiting for the law to finish what I had started. But even as I enjoyed the reprieve, I knew the fight wasn't over. The president was not someone who accepted defeat gracefully. Her ego had been bruised in front of the entire neighborhood, and people like her didn't forgive or forget. The lawsuit had stripped away her veneer of authority, and now she was desperate to claw it back. Sure enough, subtle retaliation began. My trash pickup was mysteriously delayed, leaving bins overflowing while other streets remained spotless. A complaint appeared at City Hall about unpermitted modifications to my property, though no such modifications existed. It was clear she was trying to shift the battlefield away from the courtroom and into every corner of my life. But every move she made only added to the evidence of her obsession. I documented it all, filing away new complaints, gathering new proof. If she thought she could outmaneuver me, she was wrong. The law was slow, but it was steady, and eventually it would catch up with her. As the weeks dragged on, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed. What began as a simple dispute over a barking dog had grown into a battle for principle, a fight against a system that thrived on silence and compliance. I hadn't chosen this war, but now that I was in it, I was determined to see it through, not just for myself, but for everyone who had ever been pushed into a corner by people drunk on petty power. When the envelope finally arrived in the mail, official court letterhead, crisp and heavy, I held it for a long moment before opening it. This was the verdict, the judgment that would decide not just Max's future, but the balance of power in the entire neighborhood. With steady hands, I tore it open and began to read. Chapter 6. The verdict is delivered. The letter was short, but its weight was enormous. Line by line, the verdict unfolded with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. The judge ruled in my favor. The HOA's attempt to enforce a breed-specific restriction was deemed illegal under state law. Their excessive fines, arbitrary violations, and pattern of harassment were called out for what they were, an abuse of power. The order was firm. All outstanding fines against me were dismissed. The HOA was prohibited from attempting to remove Max from my home. And most satisfying of all, the court required them to pay a portion of my legal fees. For the first time in months, I exhaled fully. The nightmare was over. But the victory was more than personal. The ruling sent ripples through the neighborhood. Word spread quickly, each homeowner learning that the once invincible board had lost. Their authority had been pierced in the most public way possible, by the law they had so arrogantly claimed to uphold. The immediate fallout was chaotic. Some neighbors celebrated quietly, emboldened by the fact that someone had stood up and won. Others were cautious, unwilling to openly defy the board, but clearly relieved to know that change was possible. And then there were those who had supported the board from the beginning, now struggling to reconcile their loyalty with the undeniable fact that the HOA had been wrong. The board itself reacted in predictable fashion. The president released a statement, dripping with defensive language, insisting that the ruling was a technicality and that they had only ever acted in the best interest of the community. But the cracks were visible. Homeowners began questioning where their dues were going, asking how much money had been wasted on a failed legal battle over one man's dog. At the next community meeting, the atmosphere was nothing like before. Instead of smug confidence, the board members looked weary, worn down by the backlash. Neighbors openly challenged them, demanding transparency, accountability, and change. What had once been whispers of dissent was now spoken aloud. The fear of reprisal broken by the court's ruling. For me, the sense of vindication was sweet. I walked into that meeting with Max's leash in my hand. His calm presence a silent reminder of everything we had endured. The board avoided my eyes, their silence louder than any words. They had tried to break me, and instead, they had broken themselves. But victory brought more than relief. It brought responsibility. I realized that while my battle had been won, the war against unchecked HOA abuse was far from over. The president was still clinging to her position. Her authority weakened but not gone, and the structure that had allowed her to wield power so carelessly was still in place. If real change was going to happen, it would require more than a court ruling. It would require action from within the community itself. Neighbors began approaching me, asking questions, sharing their own stories of fines, warnings, and intimidation. One described being fined for planting flowers that weren't on the approved list. Another had been threatened over the color of their shutters. Each story was different, but the theme was the same. The HOA had operated for years without accountability, and people were tired of it. It became clear that my fight had lit a spark. What started as a battle to save Max had grown into a movement to reclaim the neighborhood from the grip of those who misused their positions. And the first step toward that was dismantling the board's stranglehold on power. The court's ruling had created an opportunity. For the first time, homeowners weren't afraid to speak up. They weren't afraid to question. They weren't afraid to imagine a neighborhood where rules existed to serve the community, not to control it. and I knew exactly how to keep the momentum going. I began circulating information about board elections, about the process for replacing members, about the rights every homeowner had, but so few understood. I encouraged neighbors to attend meetings, to read the bylaws, to demand transparency. I wasn't asking anyone to fight my battle. I was asking them to fight their own. Meanwhile, the board floundered. The president, once untouchable, was now a symbol of everything wrong with the HOA. Her authority had crumbled, her credibility destroyed. The harder she tried to reassert control, the more desperate she appeared. And desperation, I knew, was the beginning of the end. For me, life slowly returned to normal. The violation notices stopped. The harassment ended. Max enjoyed his days without interruption, free to bark at squirrels without fear of reprisal. But beneath that normalcy was the satisfaction of knowing I had stood my ground and won. The battle had taken months, drained my energy and tested my resolve, but it had been worth every moment. Because now, when I walked through the neighborhood, I no longer felt isolated. I no longer felt like a target. I felt like someone who had faced the storm and come out stronger. Yet deep down, I knew this wasn't just my story. It was the story of every homeowner who had ever felt powerless. Every person who had ever been told to obey without question. My fight had shown that power could be challenged, that authority could be held accountable, and that no one, no matter how loud, smug, or intimidating, was above the law. The verdict had been delivered. The board had been humbled. The neighborhood was waking up. And as I stood in my yard one evening, watching Max chase the fading light, I realized that the true revenge wasn't just in saving my dog. It was in sparking the change that would reshape the community forever. But the story wasn't finished yet, because the final chapter was still to come, the one where the president, stripped of her power, would face the consequences of the empire she had built and lost. Chapter 7. The final fall of the HOA president. The weeks following the court ruling were unlike anything the neighborhood had seen before. The once feared HOA president, who had ruled with smug certainty, now stood exposed, her authority stripped bare. Her name, once whispered with either reverence or fear, had become synonymous with arrogance and failure. The shift in power was subtle at first. Neighbors who had once tiptoed around her began to ignore her entirely. Invitations she sent for mandatory compliance meetings went unanswered. Fewer people showed up to the gatherings she tried to organize, and when they did, they arrived not with compliance, but with questions, hard questions that she had no satisfying answers for. Her carefully constructed image of control began to crumble. No longer was she the voice of authority. Now she was the face of humiliation. Every mention of the court case brought back the memory of her loss, a reminder that she had failed, not only to enforce her will but also to protect the HOA from disgrace. But the real reckoning came at the next election. For years she had run unopposed. Her name automatically carried onto the board without challenge. This time it was different. The neighborhood, emboldened by my fight, rallied. Neighbors who had never considered involvement in HOA politics suddenly found themselves eager to participate. They weren't just voting against her. They were voting for change, for fairness, for a community free from fear. I watched from the back of the meeting room as ballots were cast. Max rested quietly at my feet, his calm presence a reminder of the journey that had led us here. Every name called, every hand raised, every slip of paper collected was a step closer to the end of her reign. When the results were tallied, the outcome was undeniable. She had lost by a landslide. The silence that followed was heavy. The woman who had once ruled every meeting with sharp words and tighter rules now sat frozen, her face pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. The power she had clung to so desperately was gone. The room didn't erupt in cheers. It didn't need to. The victory was in the quiet acknowledgement, the collective relief that washed over the homeowners. She was finished and everyone knew it. Her resignation came soon after, though not without bitterness. She tried to spin her departure as voluntary, claiming she was stepping down to focus on personal matters. But no one believed her. The truth was obvious. She had been defeated, not just by me, but by the very community she had tried to control. The board quickly filled with new members, neighbors who wanted to serve, not dictate. Their first actions were small but symbolic, reversing unnecessary restrictions, waiving unfair fines and rewriting policies to reflect fairness and common sense. It was as if the neighborhood itself exhaled, free at last from the weight of oppressive rule. For me, the victory was deeply personal. I had fought for Max, but the outcome had been so much larger than that. I had exposed the abuse of power, dismantled the facade of authority, and shown that no one, not even the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, was above the law. Life in the community slowly returned to something resembling normal, but it was a better normal. Kids played outside without fear of noise complaints. Homeowners planted gardens with flowers of their choosing. Holiday lights went up without threats of fines. The neighborhood wasn't perfect, but it was freer, kinder, and far more united than it had ever been. As for Max, he thrived. Every bark, every wag of his tail, every peaceful nap in the sun was a reminder of what we had fought for. He had become more than just my dog. He was a symbol of resilience, of standing firm against injustice, of refusing to be silenced. I often thought back to the night I first received that violation letter, the one that declared Max not an approved breed and threatened fines if I didn't comply. What seemed like the start of a nightmare had become the spark that ignited change. And though the battle had been long and exhausting, the outcome proved something vital, that the power of one person, armed with persistence, truth, and the law, could topple even the most arrogant of rulers. The HOA president had tried to ban my dog. She had thrown every weapon in her arsenal at me, convinced she could crush me with fines, threats, and intimidation. But in the end, her downfall was of her own making. Her greed, her arrogance, her abuse of power, all of it led to her collapse. Justice had been served, not just in the courtroom, but in the heart of the community. And as I stood in my yard one last time, watching Max chase butterflies across the grass, I couldn't help but smile. The fight had been worth it. Every late night, every ounce of stress, every moment of doubt, it had all led to this. The HOA had tried to ban my dog, but instead I banned them from power. The battle was over, the neighborhood was free, and Max, blissfully unaware of the storm we had weathered, remained exactly as he had always been, loyal, joyful, and mine.